How many of you would describe yourselves as emotionally unstable? Wow, that was fast. I'll ask again in a little while. Some of you might have changed your mind by then for that very reason. But as you kind of think about your life, as you think about the world around you, isn't it just amazing how unstable things tend to be? I mean, we are smack dab in the middle of all kinds of change. And it really doesn't matter from what kind of experience you come. We're all involved for our entire lives in this process of change. You often hear about things like the volatility of the stock market, for instance, right? And how that has the tendency to go up and down, right? And a lot of people they live and breathe according to how that graph is ultimately producing. How many of you noticed that gas prices have started to change? Right? I actually was filling up my car the other day and I stopped. Yeah, I just stopped. I was like, yeah, that's enough. All right, I was, as I got into the $49 and change region, my car could have taken over $50 worth of gas. I just wasn't emotionally prepared for it. And so at $49.90, I released, and just that was it. We often joke about how, every year, those of you who buy oil for your house, for heating your home, oftentimes we're faced with the decision of, are you going to pre-buy your oil? Are you going to lock in your price, right? Or are you going to just take your chances and hope for the best for the winter heating season? And it used to be an absolute truism that if you wanted to make the best decision for your family, all you had to do was find out what I was doing and then do exactly the opposite. Because I got it wrong every single time, right? And this just kind of speaks to the volatility of the world we live in. We all drive in cars, and no matter what condition your car is in, it is worsening in its condition, right? Like the tires are wearing, parts of the car are wearing out, and ultimately the car will have to get some major overhaul or might just outright need to be replaced. How many of you looked in the mirror this morning and were pleased with what you saw, right? We all can look at some before and after pictures, and I'll bet that as you're sitting here this morning, you can reflect on a time in your life that maybe you would perceive as like better than life right now, right? Like if we were to just invite everybody to answer the question, hey, if you could go back to and lock yourself into a particular time of your life, like where would that be? And some of you might say, it was 5 years ago, or it was 10 years ago, or it was when I was, 24. It's like the best year of my life. Or maybe some of you are sitting here saying, life is better now than it ever has been. The reality is that we're all changing, and our lives are changing, and the world is changing. Our emotions change, right? We range from happiness, right, to sadness, and then kind of back to maybe like just being overly elated about something and then finding ourselves depressed because of something else. And then beyond like what's going on in our own individual lives and within like the very close parts of our families and our most close relationships, the world is changing. Culture is rapidly changing. And many of you would be like me, where you just find it confusing. It's just confusing. You think about what we're facing as a world, what we're facing as a society, what we're facing even as a local community, and it feels like, there's a lot of confusion about the world in which we live. And some of you who, especially those of you that are let's just say, much older, we often hear of previous generations speaking of, these days where things were just so much better, right? And you could point to and talk about all different kinds of particulars about what society was like back then, whenever then was, and say how much better it was. But the reality is, no matter where you find yourself in the course of human history, You're going to live through confusing times because we are a confusing bunch of people. And so today I want to talk about stability. And the reality is stability is a very novel concept, right? Because we have so little of it when it comes to our lives. It's something that most of us, we love, at least for portions of our lives, we want to experience stability. And not only do we want to experience stability, but we want people that we do life with, we want for them to be stable. We want to live forever. We want the people that we love to live forever. But how many of you know that that's not how it works, right? And so with the ebb and flow of our lives, stability just proves itself to be kind of a very novel concept. But in this series, we're talking about some of the characteristics or attributes of God. And one of the very important attributes of God, which we're going to talk about today, is his stability. And that could sound very unexciting, right? Like if I just said, hey, we're going to talk about how stable God is, most would be like, all right, well, this shouldn't take very long, right? I mean, like how exciting could it be, to look into and see what it means to worship and to serve a God who in his very nature is limitless when it comes to his stability. So I want to turn our attention to Exodus chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We're going to read a number of verses where there's an introduction that takes place between a person. His name is Moses, and he is introduced for the first time in his life to God. Exodus chapter 3 gives us the account of this first meeting that Moses has with God. Now, Moses, as many of you know, grew up in the Egyptian court. He himself was a Hebrew, born to Hebrew slaves, but was miraculously preserved and rescued and raised in the house of Pharaoh himself. Until ultimately, his life took a sudden change in direction, and he found himself having to flee for his life from Egypt. And for a number of years, Moses lived his adult life in the land of Midian. And he got married, and he had kids. And we find Moses here at work when he meets with God. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. One day, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. How many of you would say that happened to me once? Again, just looking for the emotionally unstable people in the room here. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up, right? That is, the bush was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush. Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. And take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Just interesting side note, I imagine Moses at this particular point in his life had long forgotten from where he had come. As I said before, he grew up in the court of the Egyptians who were not his people. Fled for his life both from the Egyptians as well as his own people, the Hebrews, and now found himself living in a land of people that were not his own. And God here reminds him, I am the God of your forefathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress, because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. But Moses protested after God had said to him, I want you to go and deliver my people from this bondage. Moses protested and he said, if I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? And then what should I tell them? So here Moses is confronted with the very fact that this introduction that's taking place between him and God leaves him unsure of exactly whom he is even speaking with. What is his name? They're going to ask me, and I'm not going to be able to tell them the answer. So what should I call you? And God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. Tell them my name. Tell them I am. And I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel. Yahweh, that is our transliteration of the personal name of God, I am. I am, or Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations. We are talking about the eternal, the infinite stability of God. And so what I want to look at here for a few moments as we read through this text and discover the name that God provides to us for himself is the name I am. We have talked about this from time to time. We will talk about it until Jesus returns, because this is a very, very important understanding for us in our theology, in our understanding of who God is. That God is, in fact, a personal God. You'll often hear me when referring to God as we are talking about him, that the Bible will describe God not in some generic sense, but in fact will kind of contrast this personal God with the more generic understanding or thoughtfulness of just some God. That is as if God were to say to us, listen, I am God, and I have a name. And with that name comes a nature that is inherent to who I am as a being. That is, I am who I am. Or, as some translations would read, I am that I am. Or, I will be who I will be. This is the self-revealed God of the universe, of the world, and of you and me. And so I am is the personal name of God. And what it reveals to us is that God in his nature is eternal. And that God is in his nature, the fancy word we would use in describing the solidness or the stability of God, the fancy word we might use is that God is immutable. That is, he is incapable of change. He's incapable of change. God, in his very nature, in his very essence, is incapable of change. Very, very different from you and me, who, for better or for worse, are capable of change, right? At times we have changed for the better, at times we have changed for the worse. But God cannot change. It is incompatible. Change is incompatible with the nature of who God is. Now, why couldn't God change? Why would that be? There are some, I think, logical or even philosophical reasons for why God can't change. One of them would be because God exists outside of time. So you and I, we live in this dimension called time. And in the dimension of time, there are such things as before and after, right? We talked about looking in the mirror this morning. What you saw in the mirror today is different from what you would have seen in the mirror before today. of yesteryear, of years gone by, right? There has been change that has occurred in your physical appearance because we live in the dimension of change where there is before and after, but God lives outside the dimension of time. He does not or is not confined by time like you and I are. And so for God, there is no before and after. The only before and after that exists with God is the before and after that has to do with how he interacts relationally with you and me. Because God exists outside of time. He's not bound through time as we are. And so in order for change to happen, there has to be a before and an after. There has to be a moment where something was different from how it is now. Are your heads spinning yet? Or is this an easy concept to grasp, right? Like change requires before and after. And where God is not subject to time like you and I are, there's no time in which there can be, before God was like this, but now after such and such has taken place, or after this amount of time has elapsed, now we find God more like this. That is incompatible with the nature of God. Another reason why God cannot change is because God is perfect. How many of you are sitting next to somebody who's perfect? That was an opportunity. God is perfect. Now, as I said before, change always happens for the better or the worse, right? Otherwise, it isn't change. So change occurs, and because we are imperfect, we experience change. But God, where he is already and has always been perfect, change cannot occur within his nature. It cannot, because he's perfect. You see, change requires that either we are lacking something that is needed, right? And so when we get that something that is needed, we change for the better. Or let's say there's something about you that's not really good, something negative, something detrimental to your character. If change sees that thing kind of going away, fading, like, there's an improvement in your life with that thing going away, then we would consider those kinds of changes to be positive, right? But God has never lacked for anything. There's never been an instance in which God has needed or has lacked some particular characteristic or attribute that would make him better or that would improve who he is. Because he's perfect, and you cannot improve upon perfection. Neither is there anything that there has been about God where it's like, God, if I could be perfectly honest with you, I would love to see some improvement in this area of your life. I would love to see some improvement in this area of your existence. Like, there's never been anything about God that we could point to and say, God, that's not really up to God-like standards. And so how about we work together on seeing this attribute of yours improve? So there's nothing that's ever been about God that is needed to go away. There's never been the need for him to lose or to improve in some detrimental attribute. And so therefore, God can neither change for the better or change for the worse. He is perfect. God is immutable. He's incapable of change. Now, let me ask you this. Why would that be a good thing? Why would it be good? Because when we think about change in our experience, much of the change that we experience is necessary, right? And it's good. I mean, we can talk all day long about how, my body's breaking down, right? I was at a wedding yesterday where there was a lot of barbecue. We were all joking about how here we are, sitting at the table, chomping on Tums, right? Just to make sure we could handle what our bodies were trying to digest. I didn't have to worry about that 20 years ago, right? But things are a little different now than they were back then. So regardless of all those things that are, just kind of a bummer when it comes to change, I mean, there's lots of things that need to change. There are parts of me that need to change. There are parts of you that need to change. There are parts of our experience in this world that we need to see change, right? And hopefully, much of our lives are inserting ourselves into areas where change is necessary and pushing forward an agenda that would see change improve the experience of all mankind. So why, where so much change is good, why isn't it good, or why is it a good thing that God cannot change? Well, certainly we could look again at, he's already perfect, so a change would be a change not for the better, right? A change would be a change for the worse. But why is it good that God can't change? Well, for one thing, it means that God can't contradict himself. God can't contradict himself. We got some teenagers in here, some kids. How many of you would say your parents contradict themselves from time to time? But you don't have to raise your hand. I don't want to get you in trouble. Right? Parents contradict themselves all the time. We have contradicted ourselves in how we have administered discipline for one child in one particular case. And then when a very similar kind of situation pops up with a sibling, we handle that altogether differently. Why? Well, because we're emotional people, right? And so we're contradictory. We change and waffle. I can't tell you how many times I found myself, here I am in charge of this organization, right, where there's lots and lots of people who are involved, lots of employees. And so, we have human resource issues that come up from time to time. And, sometimes a question comes, hey, how are we going to handle this? And it's like, oh my goodness, all right, now I got to go in a creative mode to figure out, how do I handle this and yet still be consistent with, how that is ultimately fair to everybody else, right? And it's practically impossible. And that's sometimes because we're facing impossible situations, but sometimes it's just that, I am in and of myself self-contradictory. I could tell you I feel very strongly about one particular thing, right? But then if we were to continue the conversation, you would ultimately unravel something else that doesn't quite work with, what I've stated over here. Welcome to the human experience, right? Those of you that think that you are fully and completely without contradiction, well, you're mistaken. You just, apparently somebody hasn't been able to get through to you the way in which you see things differently from time to time. But God, he can't contradict himself. And you know why that's good news? Because it provides us with an immense level of assurance. It's crazy, really. It's crazy the amount of assurance that you and I can live our lives with when it comes to being in a relationship with God because of his inability to contradict himself. The fact that he can't contradict himself means he cannot renege on a promise that he has made. He cannot. A promise he has made, a promise he has truly made, he cannot renege on. We, in our relationships, we experience the reneging of promises all the time, right? People say they're going to do something, they promise they're going to do something, and then they don't come through. But God, he cannot. His nature, unlike mine, like I was describing a moment ago, his nature is never in conflict with itself. When we talk about the nature of God, we talk about God's infinite love. How many love that God has infinite love? Isn't that great? God also is infinitely just and righteous. In the same way that God is infinitely love and loving, with no opportunity for either improvement or decay, so God is when it comes to his justice, his righteousness, his mercy. Like those things that we see as somewhat polarizing, as somewhat like, well, how can these two things live in perfect compatibility with one another? Within the nature of God, they do. He's never in conflict with himself. He is never at odds with himself with, what am I going to do about this? How am I going to handle this? How am I going to execute true and perfect justice in this regard? How is my justice going to maintain its perfectness in light of my perfect love? There's never a problem when it comes to God. That is, if you think about it, it will rattle your brain. It is practically impossible for us to really wrap our minds around the extent to which God's infinite characteristics can all live in harmony perfectly with one another, because we just don't get it. We just don't get it. But God will never renege on what he has promised. If he has promised justice, he will execute justice. If God has promised mercy, he will never revoke his mercy. And that's what we need. If God is going to be the judge of all the earth, and if you and I are ultimately, like we talked about a number of times, if you and I are ultimately accountable in our lives for how we live, isn't it good to know that God is just, perfectly just, perfectly loving, perfectly understanding? So God can't contradict himself. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, in a book that's talking about the just essentially the betrayal of the nation of Israel from the true commandments of God, God says this of himself. He says, "For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." Not only where God promises the execution of justice, will that justice ultimately come to full fruition. But the very fact that you and I are here living and breathing even now is a result of the fact that God does not change. You know what would happen if God did change? We would all be gone. If God were anything like you and I are, we'd all be wiped out from the face of the earth because he wouldn't be able to stand it. At some point, he would just he would flip his lid, and that would be the end of it all. But it is because he does not change that we are not consumed. And that brings us to this next reason for why it's good that God cannot change. Because God cannot change, God can't become unpredictable. You ever work for somebody who's just unpredictable? It's like one day they were great, and then one day it's like, oh my goodness, what in the world happened? Right? And we're like that. But God cannot become unpredictable. Now, God certainly acts in unpredictable ways. Like we talk all the time about just how, God did a miracle, right? Or, I was praying that God would do this, or I was expecting that, this is how things were going to play out, but God did something entirely different. It doesn't mean that God doesn't act unpredictably, from our frame of reference, but God himself, in his nature, he cannot become unpredictable. You see, if God's nature could change like yours and I, like your nature can, like my nature can, if that were possible, then what pleases God one day could be altogether different from what might please him the next day. And you and I, we'd be unable to live with assurance on, like, what is it going to take for me to live a life that satisfies God, that is satisfactory to him? What is it? Like, we talk about living a life that pleases God. Living a godly life. Well, what does that mean? The only reason why we can even begin to define what it means to live a godly life, a life that pleases or honors God, is because he doesn't change. What pleases him today is no different from what pleased him 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago. With all of the change that has happened in the world and within societies and through culture, God has never, ever, ever moved. Not one little bit. And so as you read through the Word of God, which is miraculously unified in its message to us. What you'll find when translated properly, when interpreted and understood properly, is that, you know what makes God happy today? It's exactly the same thing that made God happy yesterday. We can know exactly what is required of us. We can live with assurance, undoubtedly, like, what does God require of me? What does God want? What does he want from me? I can know that. I can know it. You can know it. Do we always know it? No. Sometimes we screw that up. But it's not because we can't. We can know it because God doesn't change. His justice is guaranteed. His mercy will never be revoked, and his love never wavers. He doesn't ebb and flow with the emotion of what is happening at any particular time. And that leads me to the third thing, the third reason why it's good that God cannot change, and that is that God cannot suffer. God can't suffer. Now, we use language a lot of times when we're trying to comfort a person who is suffering, describing how God is experiencing that suffering with them. And that's not technically accurate. In order for God to be able to suffer, change would be necessary, right? There'd have to be a change in his emotional state. He'd have to go from a place where he is at one point experiencing happiness, but now experiencing the emotion of suffering. And God is incapable of that because he is incapable of change. So he cannot suffer. Now, you might say, well, that stinks. I mean, I kind of wish that God could feel what I'm feeling. Now, give me a second. What we're talking about is the fact that God is not emotionally unstable like you and I are. But neither does that mean that God is therefore filled with apathy when it comes to our experiences in this world and what you and I feel. The reality is that God, as a personal, relatable being, does feel. It's just that he feels perfectly and fully and without any transition from one feeling to the next. Anybody confused? You're supposed to be, just a little bit. When we're talking about God, and he's confusing. But, said another way, for instance, how many of you have fallen in love? Come on, you gotta really quick, you gotta get that up there, right? Because somebody is paying attention, right? You've fallen in love. We use that language, you've fallen in love. What does that mean? That means that at some point, I was triggered, right? I was triggered. Suddenly, this emotional transition took place, and I felt something for another person. I just, it might have been kind of growing and growing, but at some point I found myself, I have fallen in love with this person. What's beautiful about the unchanging nature of God is that God does not need to be triggered in order for his love to be accelerated. What that means is that there's nothing you can do, there's nothing I can do that is going to make God feel like he is more in love with us now than he was before. There's no amount of work you can do, there's no amount of money you can give, there's no sacrifice you can make that will produce in God just feelings of oh my goodness, I'm just so in love with this person. That can't happen. God cannot be triggered. He can never feel a greater sense of love because, again, his love is perfect. Theologically, we would describe God as being maximally alive. That is, his love and every other attribute of his is infinite and perfect and incapable of change. And so, therefore, it is not that he is filled with apathy. In fact, the Bible tells us that God feels what we are feeling, right? It describes Jesus as a God who is not untouched by the feelings of our infirmities, right? The struggles that we experience and that we walk through. It's not like he is just like living out there in some place where he's completely removed and untouchable when it comes to our experiences. But God, where he cannot suffer, the beauty in that is that he can rescue. He can rescue. He can come and rescue because he is not a God to be pitied. I mean, and you just imagine, like, if God could actually suffer, what kind of suffering would he be experiencing right now? If he were having the sufferings of the world piled upon him in such a way that his emotional state was wavering this way and that, how could that ever leave him in a place where he could actually be a rock, like he's described in his word? Where he could actually be a place in which we could anchor our feet, in a place where we could find ourselves grounded and standing on firm and solid ground, a place where we can have assurance and rest, knowing that regardless of how unstable I might be and how unstable my spouse might be, how unstable my children and other people that are close to me, no matter the instability that I'm experiencing in this world, God is firm. And he is solid, and he can rescue. And so God, there's no limit to his stability. But here's the problem. The problem is we often fail to experience the stability of God because you and I want to so badly, we want to change him into something he is not. Back to Exodus, a number of chapters, and a long time after where we first read Moses being introduced to Yahweh, we find the nation of Israel being miraculously delivered out of its bondage from Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. And there at the same mountain on which Moses first met with God, but this time Moses has gone up into the mountain to meet with God again, and the people were left there at the base of the mountain, and they got distracted. And they got impatient. Exodus 32, when the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother, and he was kind of the guy left in charge there while Moses was away. Come on, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. And so Aaron said, take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters and bring them to me. And all the people took the gold rings from their ears and they brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, he melted it down and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Aaron saw how excited the people were, and so he built an altar in front of the calf. And then he announced, tomorrow will be a festival to, interestingly, he uses God's name. Tomorrow will be a festival to Yahweh. There wasn't an abandonment of God, just a redefining of who that God was. The people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. After this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. The reason why sometimes we fail to experience the unchanging nature, the perfect, immutable character of God is because of our immense desire to change and to alter him into what we want him to be. The problem is our instability. The fact that me in my life, I am unstable. I am unstable in sometimes the way that I think. I am unstable in the way that I feel. I am unstable in the way that I perceive things in the world. And as all of these things assemble themselves in my life in some chaotic order, I might find myself tempted in that instability to inventing who I want God to be. Our instability is a temptation toward invention, a temptation to redefine, to recharacterize, to here's my box that I want God to fit in, and so let me just recreate him so that he fits neatly and nicely in that box. And so again, there's no limit to God's stability, but you and I, we cannot try to change him. We can't try to make God into what we want him to be. In fact, when it comes to change, the reality that you and I need to come to in our lives is I need to change. I don't need God to change. I need to change. Never, ever, ever is it an issue with God. Is it a, boy, I wish God could be more like, or, as I think about it, this is what I want God to be like. No, I don't need God to change. I need to change. And so as we close this morning, you might be sitting there, and much of what I talked about today, and just the confusion of the world in which we live, the confusion of your own life, you might just find yourself at a loss. It's like, okay, well, what should I do? What should I do? Like, how should I then live? Like, what does it mean for me to come more into alignment with who God is? What does it mean for me to adopt change in my life, to adapt to the change that is necessary, not so that I bring God closer to where I am, but so that I allow for myself to grow closer to where God is? Let me read just a handful of verses from Hebrews. Hebrews, a book dedicated to showing us the better way with the new covenant established by Christ. That I think, if just listen to these words, and I think it'll help us to understand very, very simply, like, this is what it looks like, or this is how it can look. If I pay attention to these things, these areas of my life, I will actually find myself growing more like what God wants me to be and what God wants for my life to look like. Check it out, Hebrews chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for some who have done this have entertained angels without even realizing it. Remember those in prison, as if you were there yourself. Remember also those being mistreated, as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. Good advice, right? Give honor to marriage and remain faithful to one another in marriage. God will surely judge people who are immoral and those who commit adultery. Don't love money. Be satisfied with what you have, for God has said, I will never fail you. Oh, there he is again. Talked about the faithfulness of God last week, the stability of God today. I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I will have no fear. What can mere people do to me? Remember your leaders who taught you the word of God. Think of all the good that has come from their lives and follow their example of faith. And then he says these very telling words, again, just about the nature of God. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. So don't be attracted by strange new ideas. How many of you have quoted at some point in time, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever? What that means is like what we talked about at the outset of this message, and that is that you want to know what pleases God today. All of those things that we just read about, those are things that please God. And they don't please God today because he has somehow changed or evolved into some other being than he used to be. No, it has always been that way. That is what God has always wanted, what God has always required. And it is the pursuit that you and I should be engaged in our lives today. And so we're gonna sing this beautiful song. And I've been looking forward to for weeks. I asked Caleb, hey, Caleb, I'd really like to kind of close out our message with this song. This song talks about the God of all my days. Listen, you and I, we sit here, we stand here with the experiences of our lives that have gone by, where there's nothing we can do about them. We have, the futures that we're looking forward to, and maybe your world is filled with just chaos and confusion, and it's like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And how, I just want you to sit here for a few moments and reflect on the beauty of what it means that God is the God of all my days. He's the God of all my days. He's the God of those days that I lived in chaos and confusion. He's the God of those days where I felt like nothing could ever be better. So while my life might change, while the circumstances of my life and my world might change, God is the same. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And in that, I can find stability. I can find an anchor. I can find a place where I can rest. The ushers will receive the offering while we're listening to and singing the song together, but just want to encourage you as we do this, let's worship together. And let's just experience the God of all my days.